All right, as we come to the themes, just a reminder, we took a look at the introduction on Friday, and we just want to take the first hour to really skim over the themes that are found in Isaiah. And as you read the book, there isn't a great amount of debates, because we're just observing at this point what is in the book itself. We're not trying to interpret what Isaiah is saying, but just being a long book, starting to put our hands around it so that we can start to appreciate what is in the text itself. As you go through Isaiah, you are struck right away with the emphasis that Isaiah has on the concept of holiness. The root for holiness is used in the book 68 times. So 66 chapters and 68 times Isaiah will make reference to holiness. And the particular term that is associated with Isaiah, as you can see, is that Yahweh is the Holy One of Israel. He uses that term for Yahweh 25 times within the book as a whole. And interestingly, it is spread throughout the totality of the book. It is found 11 times in chapters 1 to 35, once in chapters 36 to 39, and 13 times in chapters 40 to 66. And so you would have to state that, all right, this total book is either by Isaiah, and Isaiah is speaking in this way of Yahweh throughout the book, or that if there is another author, as the liberals propose, or later authors and redactors as are proposed, that they are certainly writing in a conscious style of Isaiah. In fact, as you go through the Old Testament, as you can see, that this term for Yahweh is only used 6 other times in the Old Testament. Significantly, the first time it appears in the biblical text is in 2 Kings 19:22, which is a record of Isaiah speaking to Hezekiah, giving his message to him. So that in 2 Kings, it is Isaiah himself who is speaking. And then to follow the Hebrew canon, it is picked up again in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 29, and 51:5, so that Jeremiah uses the term twice. And of course we know that historically Jeremiah comes after Isaiah, as well as canonically. And then also 3 times references made to this within the Psalms. And very possibly, as we take a look at Psalm 71, 78, 89, though certainly canonically they come after Isaiah. And again, there is a very real possibility that these Psalms also were written after the historical Isaiah had ministered. And so there is a very, very real possibility, but we cannot prove it conclusively, but a very real possibility that this is Isaiah's special term, yes, but also a term that he coined that was picked up by later writers within the Old Testament. Along with that, you can see once he refers to Yahweh as the Holy One of Jacob, and then also 4 times he just refers to him as the Holy One. So that 30 times within the book of Isaiah, of those 68 usages of the holiness root, it is within this phrase that is referring to Yahweh, Israel's God. And of course, that directs us right away back to Isaiah chapter 6. For certainly the book of Isaiah gives us the historical event that would focus Isaiah's eyes and his thoughts upon the holiness of Yahweh for the rest of his ministry. For it is there where he sees the vision of Adonai. I saw in verse 1, I saw the Lord, I saw Adonai, the Master, the Sovereign One, sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. And the seraphim stood above him. And, verse 3, one called to another, saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. That which fills all the earth is his glory. And so as Uzziah dies, as it were, he sees the heavenly monarch sitting upon the throne. And a good king's death does not change Yahweh's control over what is taking place on the earth. And yet, as the one who is sovereign, he is the one who is also stated 3 times to be holy. And holy has the idea to be separate, to be distinct. And of course, here it is talking about the fact that Yahweh is distinct from his creation. He is over his creation. And of course, also within this, very quickly, is a sense of a moral distinction between Yahweh and man as well. For in verse 5, in response to this vision of Yahweh, Isaiah says, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts. And again, he is stating that in this vision where Yahweh's holiness is being revealed to him, and he is the King. He is Yahweh, who is sovereign over the army of heaven. He is Yahweh of hosts. He is the commander of the armies of heaven. That certainly is superior in power to anything that can be seen here upon the earth. He is in that way the King. He is the one who is sovereign over the affairs of the earth. And Isaiah is conscious of his uncleanness. All right, and it's like coming into the temple that as Israel did, and of course he has come without the prerequisite offering. He does not have his sacrifice. He is well aware of his uncleanness. And so in verses 6 and 7, the Lord himself cleanses Isaiah within that moment, with the seraphim flying and taking one of the coals from the altar, and touches the mouth of Isaiah. And the statement in verse 7, Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. And then I heard the voice of Adonai, all right, and Isaiah has no problem at this point that this is the holy, sovereign King, Yahweh, his master, saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. And I would say at that point, even though some would, we'll get into a little bit of interpretation, though some would say, who will go for us, that what is within this context is the angelic beings, and so this is Yahweh and his angels that are saying this. Notice it is Yahweh saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And within that statement, the us seems to refer back to the eye. This is Yahweh speaking, and again, there is, or Adonai speaking, but there is at least a implication here of a distinction within the Godhead, distinction within Yahweh, who Isaiah is seeing. And in fact, when we get to John chapter 12, we find out that Isaiah here is seeing the glory of whom? The glory of Jesus. So I take the New Testament interpretation as being superior to the liberals' interpretation of Isaiah 6:8. But Isaiah then responds to who will go for us? Here I am, send me. And then he is given his commission to go and communicate God's revelation to the people of Judah, to the city of Jerusalem. And how long? Because the people are not going to respond, well, until the judgment that Yahweh will bring upon his people will be complete. And yet there will be a remnant that will have, verse 13, the holy seed in its stump. There will be a holy remnant that God is going to work through in the future to fulfill his plan and his purpose through the physical seed of Abraham. But here's Isaiah's call, and basically it's going to be the same call that is given to Jeremiah and Ezekiel as well, which is, go and speak for me and get ready because they ain't going to listen. I guess since it's being taped, they aren't going to listen, so that whoever translates it might know what I just said. But in good American, they're going to have closed ears. They're not going to respond. And in fact, your message is to bring greater dullness so that the judgment comes upon them. And the same thing will be said to Jeremiah and Ezekiel as well. You're being sent to a rebellious people. And that is Isaiah's commission. And as we say, this then becomes a key idea throughout the book. The holiness of Yahweh, the distinction of Yahweh, not only from his creation, but particularly when you get into chapters 41 to 48, also his distinction from all other so-called gods. That God is greater than the idols that the nations worship. He is, again, holy. He is distinct. He's the Holy One of Israel. And yet Israel and Judah, their history was turning away from him to the idols. But the great oracles of the superiority of Yahweh over the idols that is going to be seen later on in Isaiah obviously also flows from Isaiah's understanding of Yahweh. And not only is that understanding based upon Torah, but it's also based upon this vision that Isaiah sees in chapter 6. So chapter 6 is a very important chapter to help us understand and appreciate Isaiah and Isaiah's message. Well, right away, from realizing that Yahweh is the Holy One, we are moved, and certainly a second theme which comes in Isaiah is the sinfulness of Judah. And Isaiah portrays this in all of its perverse depravity. In fact, he begins in chapter 1 and going back to, again, the Torah, says in verse 2, "Listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth." Going back to Yahweh's own words in Deuteronomy chapter 32, calling heaven and earth to witness the words that he was giving to Israel. Now once again, listen. All of the heavens and earth are asked to convene as Yahweh speaks and brings his charge against his people. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. I have brought forth these sons, and particularly with Isaiah's focus, Judah and Jerusalem. I have been the one who have brought them up, but they have revolted against me. And this is unnatural. Animals know who their owner, their master is. Verse 3, Israel does not understand. My people do not know. My people do not understand. And then he starts to use, he's already used revolted, so that they are rebels, and starts to use the words, alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, son who act corruptly. They have abandoned Yahweh. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from him. And he just uses rich vocabulary to get across the point. They are perverse sinners. Sinful, iniquitous, evildoers, act corruptly, abandoned, despised, turn away. And you can see that Isaiah is using his vast command of Hebrew vocabulary here to paint the picture of how wayward Israel, how wayward Judah and Jerusalem were. And of course, this just begins what he is going to continue to echo throughout the book. In chapter 2, he will speak about in verses 6 through 11 how they have instead of following Yahweh, they have abandoned Yahweh. Verse 6, they are filled with influences from the east. They're soothsayers like the Philistines. They strike bargains, treaties with the children of foreigners. Their land has been filled with silver, etc. Verse 8, their land has been filled with idols. They have become, in verse 11, proud men who will be abased by Yahweh. And so they have become proud idolaters. Chapter 3, he speaks again about the fact that women and children have become their leaders. Chapter 5, he speaks of the vineyard. And we'll come back to that. But verse 7, he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold a cry of distress. And by the way, the sinfulness of Judah was seen in the fact that not only does he use all of these words for sin throughout his book, but he speaks about the fact that there is a lack of justice, there is a lack of righteousness within Jerusalem and among the people. And this is what Yahweh is going to correct. In other words, he is going to bring forth a righteous man who will bring forth justice, a righteous one, who will bring forth justice in the future because of the total lack of righteousness and injustice that was seen in the land during Isaiah's time. So these are just examples where you see in chapter 6 that Isaiah is conscious of the fact that he is himself a man of unclean lips. We see the rebellious attitude of the people that will not respond to Isaiah's message. We'll come back to it in chapters 29, 30, 31, where they turn away from Yahweh to trust in alliances with foreign nations, all the way to Hezekiah's own sin that is seen in Isaiah chapter 39. So when he begins by saying they are a people, a sinful people, a people that is weighed down with iniquity, that sets the tone for Isaiah as he will develop, particularly in the first part of the book, the sinfulness of Judah. And because of that, Yahweh's coming judgments. And again, we can just look at it in chapter 1. Verse 24, therefore the Lord God of hosts, Adonai Yahweh of hosts, the mighty one of Israel declares, I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenge myself on my foes. I will also turn my hand against you and will smelt away your dross as with lyre and will remove all your alloy. All right, judgment is coming. But Isaiah 125 emphasizes that judgment is going to be the means of Yahweh ultimately purifying his people. It is a judgment that will not lead to annihilation, but to purification. So that in verse 26, I will restore your judges as at first, and your counsels as at the beginning. After that, you will be called a city of righteousness, a faithful city. The city that is now unrighteous is because of his unrighteousness going to be judged. And yet through the judgment, God is ultimately going to purify so that the city will be restored, a righteous city. And this is key, that basic idea of unrighteousness that will be judged, and in the judgment will be purification, so that righteousness will be reestablished in Jerusalem in the future. She who is unfaithful will become faithful. That is the overarching image as far as the book is concerned. In fact, that is what Isaiah is all about. Because when we're going to take a look at the structure, we'll see that what is relayed about Jerusalem then in Isaiah's day, in Isaiah chapter 1, is going to be, by the time you get to the end of the book in chapter 65 and 66, is going to be a new Jerusalem, a faithful Jerusalem, a Jerusalem that will be righteous and just. Though Isaiah's total book will show that there is a great process that will take place for that result to occur.
Is this prophecy referring to after the exile or more eschatological?
Yes. Eschatological. Certainly, all right, this is, as I said, you got to go through all of Isaiah from chapter 1 to 65 to 66. And certainly this is going to be Isaiah's a great, now we are getting into interpretation, but this is going to be Isaiah's great revelation, is the sense that God is going to bring a physical deliverance from exile in Babylon. There will be a remnant that returns to the land. But that remnant itself, even though having physical deliverance, still needs forgiveness from sin. And so a sin bearer is going to come to bear the sin, and that sin bearer ultimately will return as the conquering king for those who put their faith in him, and it will be those who put their faith in him that will be restored in the future. Of course, that's still ahead of us, but at least as you take a look at chapter 1 to chapter 66, you can see this is Isaiah's movement, that God is not going to let Jerusalem stay as it is. He is going to bring judgments, and of course then he gets into judgment, and you can see the chapters that deal with sin by and large also deal with the judgment that God is going to bring upon the people because of their sin. Chapter 8 is particularly because of the sin of Ahaz that is seen in chapter 7, and what God is going to do, but ultimately to bring the judgments that will bring restoration, salvation, deliverance, as far as particularly Jerusalem is concerned. But along with that, Isaiah also brings up the sinfulness of the nations. Chapter 10 deals with Assyria. Actually, chapter 9 before that it dealt with the northern kingdom of Israel. But we'll include that in number 2. Obviously, it's not Judah, which is the focus of Isaiah's ministry, but Isaiah doesn't forget Israel either, the northern kingdom, that before they went into captivity, they were sinful as well. But particularly in chapter 10, he deals with Assyria. That, except for a few verses, is missing in chapters 13 to 23. We'll take a look at those oracles on Friday. But the oracles against the nations that are going to also be judged, again in chapter 28 and 34, Egypt and the other nations are also going to be judged because of their sin as well. So he brings out their sinfulness, their pride, their arrogance, their unwillingness to also practice justice, their unwillingness to do unto others as they would want others to do to them. So that even though they don't have Yahweh's law that was given to Israel at Sinai, yet nevertheless they are judged because they continue to have the ongoing arrogance and rebellion against Yahweh that was pictured in Genesis chapter 11. So it continues on, and so Yahweh predicts his judgment upon the nations, those specific nations, what they're going to go through, and then how they become characteristic and anticipatory of all of the nations who will suffer, the Gentile nations that will suffer God's judgment in the coming eschatological judgment that is given for us in chapters 24 and then only to restoration in chapter 27. And particularly chapter 47 deals with God judging historical Babylon, the defeat of Babylon that will allow the remnant that were exiled there of Judah to return to Judah. And in fact, he's already stated precisely in chapter 44-45 who the human instrument of that deliverance will be, and that is Cyrus, that is going to defeat the Babylonians to allow the remnant to escape from Babylon and return to build the temple. So this is the backdrop. Here is Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. Against that backdrop, we see the sinfulness of Judah. They are unholy, unrighteous, practicing injustice. Yet this is not God's final design for the city, for his people. His final design is that they be righteous and just, and he dwell in their midst. And so he has to and does reveal how he is going to take them from where they were to where they will be in the future. And it is against that backdrop that Isaiah brings his statements concerning salvation and, again, the different images that he uses of the Lord's means of salvation. Now, the fact that ultimately he is going to save, and I have given you the great passages that refer to salvation. We can just take a look at the very first one, because it is in chapter 11 where Isaiah strikes the theme of the fact that what he's going to do in the future is like unto what he has done in the past. So in Isaiah 11:11, then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people who will remain. From Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Anath, and from the islands of the sea. So Isaiah envisions the fact that the people of Israel have been scattered beyond just Assyria and Babylon. They're also found, as we now know historically, that some after the Babylonian captivity, the remnant was left in the land that fled to Egypt, to Cush. They go further to the east, to Elam. And Isaiah includes even to all the coastlands of the sea. That is as far away as you can get from Israel. That is the land of Israel. To that extent, the people have been scattered. And he talks about the fact that he's going to raise the standard, and he is going to bring them back to the land. And notice in verse 15, the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt. He will wave his hand over the river. With his scorching wind, he will strike in the seven streams and make them walk over dry land. Dry shah. They will walk over the land in their sandals. Now already in verse 15, you're picking up the images of the sea, and the sea being driven back, the scorching wind. All right, what is that a reminder of? The Exodus. And in verse 16, if you haven't picked it up, he makes it explicit. There will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people, just as there was for Israel in the day that they came out of the land of Egypt. There's going to be a second Exodus. And instead of coming just from one land, they're going to come literally from the four corners of the globe, from all of the coastlands to which they have been scattered, the nations and hopefully the coastlands. And God is going to make a way for them to return, not only destroying the tongue of the sea of Egypt, but also waving his hand over the river. And the river is the river Euphrates. So that what he did at the Sea of Reeds is just anticipatory of what he's ultimately going to do with the mighty Euphrates, that will open up a highway from Assyria, from the remnant of the people. And in fact, there's going to be a greater exodus with greater miracles in the future than in the past. So certainly it is pictured as a second Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, on that day of deliverance. This is what you will say: I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for although you are angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you comforted me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. For Yahweh, Elohim, is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. Yahweh is my Savior. Yahweh is the one who has delivered me. And notice, and here is the great change: I will trust. Israel finally, in this great restoration, this great salvation, will finally come to trust totally and completely in Yahweh. Again, this is another theme that's in Isaiah's book as you go through it, is the fact that Judah's problem is they do not trust Yahweh. And in fact, the the reality in chapter 37 is God puts them into a situation where they're thrust to trust Yahweh and Yahweh alone, and Yahweh brings his great deliverance of the city, which anticipates what he is going to do in the future. And they will finally come to trust totally and completely in Yahweh. Well, very quickly, and I've noticed most of these with pages in the study Bible. You can look this up a little further. But as Isaiah speaks about salvation, he starts to speak about the instrument of salvation. Who is the one that Yahweh is going to use to bring this deliverance of his people in the future? And you can see that there are these 8 great images that emerge in Isaiah, and I'll just point them out. There is the lights, the light that will shine, the child who is going to be born, the shoot, the branch that will come out of Jesse. And obviously an emphasis there on a new David, because the son of Jesse was David, and now will come another spring, another branch from the stem of Jesse, so that you can almost put in parentheses there the new David, the stone, the servant, the Redeemer of Israel. And really, G is not the individual, but we've already talked about that this deliverance is going to be a second Exodus. And the second Exodus, obviously, assumes what? A second Moses. And again, you got Deuteronomy 18. We've already talked about a prophet like unto Moses who will come forth. And now you start to see that this instrument of salvation has this sixfold characterization using the same terminology that was seen within the Torah for Moses. He truly is going to be a second Moses. He is, in chapter 42, is speaking of the coming servant that we've already seen in point E. But this servant who's going to be endued with Yahweh's Spirit in the same way in Numbers 11, Moses was endued with Yahweh's Spirit. One who will come forth as the servant in chapter 42 to establish justice. Just as Moses gave the commandments and implored Israel to follow those so that they would practice justice in the sight of the nations. Again, referring to the servant who was specially called by Yahweh, called from birth by Yahweh. And of course that reminds us of Exodus, where just as the servant will grow up before Yahweh and then enter into his calling, the same thing was seen. In fact, we extend a little back into Exodus chapter 2 through 4:12. The coming servant who will bring a covenant, a new covenant, in the same way that Moses was the one who brought the old covenant at Sinai from Yahweh to Israel. A servant who will be rejected in the same way that Moses suffered rejection, particularly at the beginning of his ministry. Exodus chapter 2. And before, obviously, the people got to the land, there was still murmuring and bickering and rebels that had to be purged out. An image that's going to be picked up in Ezekiel chapter 20. And significantly, in Numbers 12:3, Moses is directed by the Spirit of God to make the statements that he was the most humble man on the face of the earth. Now, it seems to us that that is an oxymoron for the humblest man to say he was the humblest man. And yet it was true. Even though some believe that that's an aside, added by a later hand, there's no reason why the Spirit of God couldn't, without taking away Moses' humility, lead Moses to point out that he was humble. And the same thing is going to be true of the servant, the second Moses, who is going to come. He is going to be known for his humility. And again, we'll talk about this on Friday and again next Wednesday. But a humility that is contrasted in Isaiah with the pride not only of Judah and the nations, but particularly is going to be contrasted with the pride of the king of Babylon, who will be cast down in Isaiah chapter 14. So we see the second Moses. So these images of the coming Redeemer, the instrument of salvation that is going to bring God's deliverance in the future. There's also an emphasis in Isaiah upon the Spirit of Yahweh. And I just gone ahead and listed the verses for you. But he was well aware of the fact, and we'll take a look at this when we get into the latter chapters of Isaiah, that Yahweh not only will send forth the Redeemer who is Yahweh, but the Redeemer himself is going to be empowered by the Spirit of Yahweh. That Yahweh will send. In other words, within the implication of distinction within Yahweh, and I would agree that this is only implication, it's not an explicit declaration of triunity, but certainly the idea that Yahweh sends the Redeemer who is Yahweh, who will be empowered and directed by the Spirit that comes from Yahweh, is already implying somewhat of the distinction within the Godhead, which is triunity. Now, of course, it awaits the New Testament to make that even clearer and more explicit. But certainly there is an emphasis in Isaiah upon the Spirit of Yahweh. And as we've already spoken about too, particularly flowing out of the vision of Isaiah chapter 6 is not only the emphasis upon Yahweh's holiness, but also his emphasis upon Yahweh's sovereignty. He is the King with a capital K. He is upon the throne. Nothing happens upon the earth without his sovereign plan being behind it. So that truly that which fills all the earth is his glory, because he is the one who is sovereignly in control of all that takes place. And certainly, again, it will be emphasized that he is sovereign. He knows the future in equal measure to the past. And it is because he is sovereign that he is going to do what he is going to do in the future. In fact, that's the great battle in chapter 41 to the heathen gods. All right, come on, speak. Tell us what's going to happen in the future. Come on. Can't you speak? Can't you know? Well, that you may know that I, Yahweh, am the true God. I will speak and tell you what is going to happen in the future. And so definitely part of the sovereignty of the scene is that Yahweh not only knows and controls the past and the present, but he knows and determines what is going to take place in the future as well. By the way, so much for openness theology. Isaiah was no openness theologian. In fact, when we did our series on openness in the faculty series, Dr. Cragen just said, I'm just going to go to a couple of passages in Isaiah because that's enough to deflate the whole concept that God doesn't know and doesn't control the future. And turns right to these passages in Isaiah. And so Isaiah, as with Moses, was a Calvinist. All right, there's no doubt about that. And no openness, no Arminianism allowed within their theology. So here is the sovereign Yahweh, and what has certainly pictured of Yahweh here in Isaiah is going to be picked up and again re-emphasized in the prophet Jeremiah as well. And so we come to say, all right, what is the purpose of Isaiah? And particularly as you think in terms of all of these themes of sin, judgments, restoration, and yet the image of the rebellious city full of unrighteousness, full of injustice. In Isaiah chapter 1, that will become the city of righteousness where justice is practiced. In Isaiah 65 to 66, how do you, just with reading it through a couple of times, seeing the themes, how will we state the purpose? Well, trying to bring all these components together. You can see my purpose statement in the notes. The holy Yahweh, the particular emphasis of Isaiah, will not permit unholiness in his people. He's not going to allow the present situation to continue indefinitely. He's the sovereign king who is going to step in. So he will therefore deal with them, his people, in such a way, through judgments, to chasten and purge them. Obviously, chastening and purging the faithful remnant that will emerge out of the nation, the others will be cut off, and make them fit to participate in his program, not only of being restored, but the great picture in Isaiah 2 that is picked up again in Isaiah 65 and 66. And at certain points throughout the book of Isaiah, which is Gentiles are going to participate in this glorious rule as well. They also are going to know righteousness and justice. They are going to come to Jerusalem and worship Yahweh. They too are going to follow in the ways of Yahweh. They too are going to become his people in that future day. And so just as Yahweh will come to rule over and in Jerusalem, Judah, the totality of Israel, so also chastened, purged, now faithful, trusting Israel, God's people, will also be involved in extending his rule over the Gentiles as well. And the vast majority of the Gentiles will also come to trust in Yahweh and to learn his righteous ways and practice justice as well. And so this is the vision of Isaiah. This is how we can bring together the 66 chapters of what Isaiah is all about. And ultimately, although it's going to be left to Ezekiel to emphasize this even more than Isaiah, God is doing all of this not for the glory of Israel and not for the glory of the Gentiles. He's doing this for whose glory? His own. It's going to be his person who is going to be exalted by all that he does. By the way, all of this is an echo of Deuteronomy chapter 30. That God is not going to cast off his people. He's going to do something greater than that. He's going to bring them to repentance and give them a new heart so that finally they can be the people who will make known his name throughout all of the earth. And anyone who can change rebels into those who are obedient, he gets the glory. And that's what Yahweh has set himself to accomplish. It's already been given in skeleton form within the Torah. And again, Isaiah now is being directed by the Spirit of God to fill in more of those details of that skeleton that was given by Moses. All right, those are the themes and the purpose. And I would state that there is not a great deal of debate about the purpose. That I was somewhat surprised again this last week as I've been scanning the commentators that, and different terminology might be used, but that by and large, I mean, the emphases that we've seen placed within this purpose statement are what you will find stated within the major commentaries on Isaiah, which kind of gives us a satisfaction that we're not out to sea, having read Isaiah, not having seen these foundational elements that certainly is what Isaiah is all about as he writes. All right, before break, do we have any questions or comments you have just on the themes and the purpose before we jump into the structure of the book?
Yes, in the redemption, let me see, this is number, okay, in the film where we have the redeemer, we see Yahweh as the redeemer of Israel, but there is something we have here in chapter 26. The last two verses, long time ago I have facing that verses and do have to talk to someone with a different point of view of theology with me, and he let me understand that the Lord is speaking here about the Armageddon.
About what?
We see
Armageddon.
yes, and where he says, let the people come and get into their womb and wait there, and let me see.
All right, the question is whether Isaiah 26, 20, and 21 is referring to Armageddon. The way I would put it at this point is that Yahweh is stating at this point that he is going to defend his people at the time of the pouring out of his judgment upon all of the earth. Certainly when you get to the book of Revelation, Armageddon plays a role in this, but I would see this more broadly as related to Revelation chapter 12, where Yahweh the Lord commits himself to defend his people, from satanic attack, as the dragon is cast down, and that as the judgments of God come upon the dragon and his minions during the tribulation period, in particular the latter part of the tribulation period, then God is not going to take Israel out of the world, but is going to defend them, is going to protect them throughout the judgments that are going to take place, at least those that he is determined to protect. So rather than saying specifically Armageddon, of course, to have put a microphone in Isaiah's face and said, "Are you talking here about Armageddon?" He just go, "Duh." I mean, it hasn't been revealed yet. So I think we have to allow Isaiah to be Isaiah. Don't try at this point to say, well, Isaiah is speaking about this. Isaiah is speaking in this terminology that can be picked up by a later writer and made more specific as far as events might warrant. But I would say even there, I would look at this as God's statement to Israel that in the day when he's punishing the nations, he will protect at least the remnant that he is redeeming within Israel. I just leave it at that. Don't try to write a tribulational manual from Isaiah. It's not there. You can't. In fact, we talked about this last time. You can't even put a chronology of Isaiah together. I mean, this is Isaiah. Very, very few chronological markers. Very, very few. In other words, there is much more of a this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen in Ezekiel than you find in Isaiah. And we'll talk about this on Friday, that Isaiah can in one breath be talking about something close and then something far away. And even in the far away, in two statements, I would assume he could be saying something about event A and then B, event B within two sentences. That's Isaiah. That is the challenge of Isaiah, is the fact that he is giving you statements and not always putting those within into a sequence for you. That's not how the Spirit of God is leading him. So to a certain extent, even within the Old Testament, you've got to take the general points that Isaiah is making, and at least when it comes to the steps that God is going to take in the restoration of Israel in the future, you got to wait for Ezekiel chapters 33 to 48, which gives us, particularly chapters 33 to 39, which gives us more of a, step by step, and this is what Yahweh is going to do to reverse this. Okay. All right, let's, Chris, before we take our break.
A question about the second Moses.
Mm-hmm.
It's things that you have listed here. Do what Yahweh's Spirit called by Yahweh, give a covenant, rejected his humility. Seems like all these were fulfilled in his first coming. Would number 2, about establishing justice, be fulfilled in his first coming? Because isn't that passage...
that passage is quoted in Matthew... While I'm running through Matthew, and it just isn't popping. It's quoted in Matthew, you're right. But what is seen within Matthew is, all right, this is why the Lord acts humbly at his first coming. Because he is coming to suffer. He is not coming as the king. Now as he comes humbly as the king too in Matthew chapter 21. He's going to come humbly even the second time, but the second time to establish justice. So that, yes, all of these things are true about Yahweh, Jesus, at his first and second coming. I mean, the character of Jesus is the character of Jesus. He didn't come... He came in a humiliated state at his first coming. At his second coming, he'll come in a glorified state. But in that glorified state, he has not now become a proud, boastful individual. He is still humble. You can be humble and yet be exalted. All right? Moses was exalted before Israel, but he was still the humblest man on the face of the earth. So yes, these characteristics should have been seen, and were seen in the Redeemer when he first came. And he is, and I think allows himself to be referred to as the prophet who is going to come in John chapter 6. Instead of even saying, no, I'm not that prophet. He even talks about the fact that I've given you better bread than Moses, because I'm the bread. I'm giving myself, not just manna, not a physical manna from heaven. I am the bread from heaven. Feed on me, feast on me. That is where salvation is found. So in other words, he doesn't deny it. In fact, he goes ahead and amplifies it and makes sure you get the point that he's the second Moses. So I think John chapter 6 is an indication that yes, we should see the characteristics of the second Moses seen within Jesus while he was here upon the earth. But at that point, he's not glorified. He doesn't take his proper role, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That awaits, the future. But that doesn't change his essential character. That doesn't change his essential being that was reflected in his first coming. All right, so his glory is veiled, but not his person. All right, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll start to look at the structure and the interpretive problems which flow as we go through the book. All right, let's return to think about the structure of Isaiah. And at this point, we'll get the big picture in mind, and then we'll move through and take a look at each specific section of the book and work our way through it section by section, and we will incorporate the interpretive issues as we go through. I put a note there that as you go through Isaiah, you see Assyria and Babylon both being mentioned. Now, at the time when Isaiah prophesied, there was a period from about 709 to 703 BC when Babylon was able for a number of years to gain a measure of independence from their Assyrian overlords. But at the beginning of his ministry, and particularly at the end of his ministry, Babylon, the city of Babylon, the southern part of Mesopotamia, was under the vassalship of the Assyrian Empire. By and large, during Isaiah's life, Babylon did not have an independent existence. It was part of Assyria. Now, Babylon, as a city and as a city-state, an empire, had tremendous influence within the ancient Near East. In fact, the kings of Assyria, beginning with Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 BC, through to the destruction of the Assyrian Empire in 605 BC, finally, the kings of Assyria would refer to themselves as kings of Assyria and Babylon, to try to show that they incorporated the ancient Babylonian kingdom within their kingdom. Now, they weren't king of Babylon and Assyria. They were king of Assyria and Babylon, because Assyria, at this point, the northern part of Mesopotamia, was the important center of their empire. They were not Babylonians. They were Assyrians. And yet the focal point of Isaiah's future prophecy about the nations concentrates more on Babylon than on Assyria. In fact, you can note that with the destruction of the Assyrian army, or at least the 185,000, so that Sennacherib returns in chapter 37, that with the historical interlude that ends in chapter 39, Assyria is only mentioned by name one time in the last 27 chapters of Isaiah. That's in 52:4. The focus, very definitely, in fact, not a whole lot is said about Babylon. As you can see just in 43, 47, and 48. But even before that, Babylon has become more of the focus of Isaiah's statements concerning what Yahweh will do in the future than Assyria. Now, he does speak about it in chapter 10, how Yahweh is going to cut down Assyria, how Assyria is going to be his means of judgment upon the northern kingdom, and how they are going to spread through the southern kingdom, ultimately to be cut down and cut off by Yahweh. So that Isaiah does see, and certainly the focus, I shouldn't say so much the focus, but the background of his own life is Assyria. And yet God does lead him, as we've already talked about from 2 Kings and picked up in Isaiah 39, to know that the ultimate empire that is going to arise to take Judah into captivity, destroy Jerusalem, will be Babylon. And so that becomes more, if we could put it this way, of his eschatological. He looks to the future. He looks to what God is going to do to Babylon. Now, this becomes important when we start to take a look at the structure. There is almost unanimity in the fact that we have a basic threefold division within Isaiah. Now, we have an introductory statement we've already taken a look at in 1:1 that relates us, as we've already seen, to this is the vision. The whole book is the vision of Isaiah. So it is a vision given through the prophet Isaiah concerning Jerusalem, Judea and Jerusalem. Well, that's the special focus. And that's assumed, obviously, the place from which and to which he ministers during the reigns of Uzziah through Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So that introduction gives us these four statements concerning the character of the book, the author of the book, and his historical background as far as place and time is concerned. We've already looked at. Then we get into the three major divisions, and so that we can have an alliteration, I refer to chapter 1, verse 2, all the way through 35:10, as condemnation. Sometimes this is referred to as the portion of judgments. Now, realize, we've already looked at it, that even though this part of Isaiah does speak about the sin of the people and God's ultimate restoration, certainly it is dealing with God's condemnation, God's judgment, what he is going to do because of the situation of the city and the people at that time. And implied that this then continues as far as the majority until the time of restoration, the time of salvation comes. Now, because this takes material that Isaiah verbally gave to the people of his own day, there is a very definite Assyrian background behind what he is saying as he anchors events, as he anchors his word in events that were taking place, like Isaiah chapter 7 and 8 and Isaiah 9 and 10. And even when we get to Isaiah 28, 29, 30, 31, as he incorporates oracles that he gave to the leaders and to the people during Hezekiah's reign, even though he doesn't specifically give the chronology by what he's talking about. Don't turn to Egypt. Well, that was a particular challenge, temptation to Hezekiah and the leaders. We picked that up in 2 Kings 18, that with the Assyrian onslaught, the Assyrian power, how they were tempted to turn to Egypt for support and for military support during that time, and establishing an alliance with Egypt against the Assyrians. So when he's talking here about don't go down to Egypt, that's just a weak vessel, that you can't trust them. Put your trust in Yahweh. Obviously, he is using that historical background to bring the message that is seen within the book. So all we're saying is in 1:2 through 35:10, and certainly taking a look at 2 Kings and even the time when Isaiah is ministering, it was a time when Judah was going through the Assyrian crisis, if I can use that term. So that from 745 through the death of Hezekiah in 685 BC, during that time, every king in Judah had to deal with Assyria. Am I going to be faithful? Am I going to be a vassal of the Assyrians? Or am I going to stand up to the Assyrians, not pay my taxes, and risk military defeat at the hands of the Assyrians? I mean, the latter years of Uzziah, particularly when you get into Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, they had to deal with Assyria. If they got up every year and gave their State of the Union address, as our president did last night, the first thing they would say is, all right, and this is what we're going to do this year in our relationship with Assyria. Just as since 9/11, everything in America has been terrorist. What are we going to deal with how are we going to deal with the terrorist threat? Well, for each one of these kings, they had to deal with the Assyrian threat. That's the day in which Isaiah lives. This is the background. And interestingly, after we have the collection of his oracles in chapters 36 to 39, we have this historical narrative, what we refer to as the historical connection, the historical interlude. And significantly, Isaiah reverses the events that take place here, so that we can see when we get to Isaiah chapter 38, verse 6, that his deliverance of the city is something he's going to do in the future. Then the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, saying, beginning Isaiah 38:4, go and say to Ezekiel, thus says the Lord, the God of your father, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your life. And I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend the city. He is promising here to do for Hezekiah what historically has been recounted in chapter 36 and 37 that he did for Hezekiah. And so taking a look at history, what we see is this delegation that comes from Babylon after God first raises Hezekiah back to life and then gives him deliverance from the Assyrians. Now, this is at a time period right around 703, 702, where the Babylonians were seeking his help, his alliance against the Assyrians. And in his folly, Hezekiah is willing to listen and show them his treasures, that he is a worthy partner for them in alliance. And then God basically, don't trust them either. You can only trust me. So as he deals with Assyria, he turns first to look to Egypt. They're worthless. He turns to Babylon. They're worthless at that time. So ultimately, what we see in chapter 37, 38, he can only throw himself completely upon Yahweh. He has to trust him completely. And again, Hezekiah learns to trust Yahweh, and that's the lesson that is seen in Hezekiah's life, that Isaiah says that ultimately the people as a whole are going to learn in the future after they go through the exile. So we have the faith of Hezekiah, which leads to Assyria's belief, 701 BC. But in the year or two before that, 703, 702, leading up to 701 BC, we see the folly of Hezekiah. That is the basis for Isaiah's statement that the Babylonians will be the ones who will take the southern kingdom into exile. Then, as you can see with the dotted line, as though this prophecy has now become reality, we have in chapters 40 to 66, we have Isaiah speaking a message of comfort to Jerusalem in exile. Comfort, comfort my people. She's paid double for her sins. And so begins the steps that Yahweh will take to restore Jerusalem and to bring the people to himself. Now, the interesting thing is, and even liberals, as they read these last 27 chapters, have to realize is as opposed to the first part of Isaiah, that as you read 1, 2 through 35, it might be few and far between. But you do have times when Isaiah does make reference to events of his day. The significant thing in chapters 40 to 66 is that Isaiah never makes reference to specific events that the exiles went through in Babylon. The one specificity is when it's all over, Cyrus is going to be the Lord's instrument to defeat the Babylonians and allow the people to go back and rebuild. And of course that is stated precisely where Yahweh says, okay, I will tell you how precise I can tell the future. I will specifically talk about that event. But very little, no mention of any Babylonian king during the time of the exile. No statement about, this is Nebuchadnezzar. This is Nabonath. This is Belshazzar. The interesting thing is though he speaks to the exiles. In fact, Vivar Childs goes all the way to say that later editors took the specific details, because he views this as being written by someone in the Babylonian exile, took the details out to make it sound more like Isaiah of the time of Hezekiah. Now, how's that for special pleading by a liberal? It's not there because he was there, but later editors took it out so that we have the idea as we read the book that it was the original Isaiah who wrote it. I don't know about you, but I have greater faith in the fact that it's not there because the original Isaiah wrote it in the first place. So the same basic pattern, the same basic style is followed. at the end of the book as the beginning of the book. In fact, that is one of the hallmarks now. Even liberals will say we can't argue anymore about language. Because basically, okay, even though the poetry of the last 27 chapters is exquisite, we have some portions of exquisite poetry also in the previous chapters as well. And so many of the verbal statements and the images and the themes that are seen in the early part of Isaiah, seen in the latter part of Isaiah as well. And we'll come back to this with the interpretive issue, but the only reason liberals have any problem with what is in Isaiah comes down to the issue of predictive prophecy. Because to say that Isaiah wrote the whole book and completed the whole book by 680 BC is to have to confess that God can speak about the future before it happens. And you have to realize that that is the hallmark of a non-believer. A non-believer cannot state that to be true. And so that's their problem with Isaiah. So they still want to be a quote-unquote Christian. They got to find some way to justify, their study of Isaiah and why Isaiah is in the Bible, and so that's why they come up with what they come up with. So that gets ready for the first interpretive issue. But we're back now because it does flow out of the structure of the book. For certainly, the last 27 chapters assume that those who hear the message are in exile. And so Isaiah speaks to that reality before it historically had taken place. And gentlemen, you can't read it. You've read Isaiah and you're getting ready to read it again. As you read again, come to those last 27 chapters and realize, and hopefully see it. I mean, you learn it yourself as you read it rather than having someone else point it out to you. But as you read it, realize that Isaiah is speaking directly to those who are suffering God's judgment and giving them words of comfort in their judgment for how God is using this to accomplish ultimately his plan and his purpose for the city of Jerusalem and the people of Judah. So here is the basic structure of the book. Now, obviously you can only include so much in a chart. So what I have done, as you can see, is show you that Isaiah ends as he begins. We've already spoken a little bit about this. That the people are rebels against Yahweh. The book begins on that note, the note of the rebellion of God's people. It ends on a note of the rebels. And speaks in verse 24 of chapter 66, then they, that is those who worship the Lord in Jerusalem, shall go forth and look on the corpses of men who have literally rebelled against me. Same term that is used in 1:2. The place where Isaiah began with a rebellious people ends with those going out to see what God has done with the rebels. For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all mankind. The rebels will suffer irreversible judgments that will be known and seen by the inhabitants of Jerusalem as a reminder of what has taken place to the rebels. obviously also as a picture of those who might rebel in the future. But at this point, he has dealt with the rebels against Yahweh. He speaks in chapter 1 about how they desecrate the new moon and Sabbath, as opposed to chapter 66:23, where it shall be from new moon to new moon and Sabbath. From Sabbath all mankind will come down. All flesh will come down to bow down before me, says Yahweh. Right? And so there's not going to be a desecration of these days within the future. The present city that was a harlot in Isaiah's day will be created a rejoicing in the future. 65:18. And Isaiah 1 ends again with a term about the rebels, that they will burn together and there'll be none to quench them. And again, we've already read that in chapter 66, verse 24, it ends, their fire shall not be quenched. Same verb that was used back in chapter 1, verse 31. And they shall be an abhorrence to all mankind. Certainly what Isaiah is showing is that the rebels of chapter 1 have been judged by the time you get to chapter 66. And because of their judgment, that continues as the book comes to an end, that then leads to Yahweh having dealt with the rebels, establishing Jerusalem into the city that he wanted it to be. And so from the sad condition of chapter 1 to the new condition, the position of honor toward Yahweh that is seen in chapter 65 and 66. So this is the big picture of the book. And adapting Dorsey's work on the literary structure of the Old Testament, and though I would not go to the stake, this is more, if I might put it this way, a guide to direct our thinking of the book. But certainly what this structure allows us to see is there are some very definite echoes between the beginning and the ending of Isaiah. You have it before you. Very definitely, as we've seen, there are some very definite verbal thematic links between chapter 1 and chapters 65 and 66. That what is given to us as the problem in chapter 1 is what is resolved by the time you get to chapter 65 and 66. But then you can broaden that out to see that just as he begins in chapter 1 speaking about the desecration of new moons and Sabbath, it is very, very interesting that when you come to the last of the movements in the last 9 chapters, 58 to 66, he will begin again with a condemnation of empty religious practices that must be corrected and will be corrected before Jerusalem will be the city that Yahweh wishes it to be, where in the end you'll see the wolf and the lamb will feed together, the lion will eat straw like an ox, they'll walk nor hurt or destroy in all my holy mountains, which picks up exactly the picture which comes at the culmination of the introductory oracles in chapters 11 and 12. The wolf will dwell with the lamb and the lion will eat straw like an ox, etc. So that the picture that is seen in chapter 1 to chapter 12 of how God is going to move from the rebellious nature of his people to ultimately restoration, deliverance, restoration, and the worship of Yahweh in the future, where chapter 12 ends, that movement that is seen in those chapters is again seen in the last 9 chapters, where again, Yahweh is going to move from the desecration of the people to make Jerusalem a rejoicing. We take a look at chapters 12 to 27 of Yahweh's judgment and humiliation, beginning with the proud king of Babylon and then picking up the other nations of his day, ultimately to look ahead into chapters 24 and following to the nations of the earth in the last days, and how God is going to bring his judgment upon them, humbling these proud kings of the earth, and how in chapters 49 to 57, how he will exalt a humble servant that will be lifted up and be the means of Israel's forgiveness of sin. And then in chapters 28 to 35, how he collects, woe, 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 don't trust in earthly powers, and how as he speaks to the exiles that is there in Babylon, the midst of idolatry, don't trust in the idols the Gentiles trust in Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So that even chapters 28 to 35 prepare us for the fact that man is untrustworthy. Yahweh and Yahweh alone, and in fact not only man, but the gods that men worship are untrustworthy. Trust in Yahweh alone. And so the historical narratives that show Yahweh's supremacy over all earthly and divine powers are given to us in the center. All right? He has already worked in history to show that he is completely trustworthy. So because of what he's done in the past, certainly you should hear his message concerning what he's going to do in the future and what kind of response until that takes place the hearer of Isaiah should have, which is trust in Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So this gives us somewhat of a guide, and again, to point out that there are some very, very definite connections between the beginning and the end of the book. And we'll just have to end with this morning. But when we think in terms of reference material on Isaiah, tools to use, there are 3 outstanding evangelical works on the book. One of a previous generation by E.J. Young. In fact, E.J. Young was the originally designed editor of the New International Commentary. He only edited one work, his own, and that was on Isaiah. That was the original NICOT. But Young passed away, and Harrison took over the editorship, and now it is Robert Hubbard out of Denver. But his volumes were the original NICOT volumes that Urbans has continued to keep in print. They're now a 3-volume paperback. Young was professor at Westminster. Yes, he was all millennial, but that doesn't take away from he was very knowledgeable in the Hebrew language, lexicography, grammar, and his volumes on Isaiah are worth having upon your shelf because of their linguistic excellence. However, when Young passed away, Harrison assigned to Oswald, who was at and still at Asbury Seminary, to bring a more contemporary replacement of those 2 books, and those have come out and are very good works that give the present state of Isaiah studies within evangelicalism today. So Young and Oswald are the 2 exegetical works that I would recommend you have on the book, although both put their exegetical notes and footnotes as the NIC series was designed to do.
Is Oswald, is he also on the Linus, or is he a pre-Linus?
Read the book and try to figure out. I can't tell.
Is Harrison as
Ark Harrison was just the editor. So, of Harrison was the editor of the NICOT
Okay.
after Young and before Hubbard.
yeah, but does he has some
No,
weekend over
no.
Isaiah?
Harrison was the editor of Oswald's work.
Oh,
Oswald is the author. I would say the same thing with Motir. I think Motir is pre-mill, but you'd have a hard time telling it. And there's a reason for that, and that is you got to realize that many evangelical publishers today want works that appeal to the whole evangelical constituency, so that the men tend to talk more broadly about eschatological matters rather than specifically. So I don't know. Oswald did teach for a number of years at Trinity where you have to sign your pre-mill to teach there. So I'd assume he's a confessional premillennialist. But you'd have a hard time, seeing that within his commentary. Same thing with Motir. I think he's a pre-mill, but you'd have a hard time picking it up just from reading his commentary. But I would say the most beneficial, most useful work on Isaiah is the work by J. Alec Motir. Yes, get Oswald and Young for their exegetical help, but I think to catch the flow of the book and you'll see that I agree with Motir more often than not against the other two. So that's J. Alec Motir. Now, he also had an abridgment of this within the Tyndale series, a little paperback. But if you can, get his standalone paperback that's about 500 and some pages. Get his unabridged commentary on Isaiah. And I put down Worsby, hopefully that's a very, very simple exposition of the book. You can probably take his basis and go and fill in much data from these other works that will, I think, give you a more extensive, exegetically driven exposition than what Worsby has, but at least it gives you a quick little thumbnail sketch of how to exposit the book of Isaiah. There aren't any great expositions out there at this time in print, so it's the best we can do. But the real 3 volumes you need that you should ultimately have as you work through Isaiah are Oswald, Young, and Motir. And if you're going to, which one should you get first? I would get Motir first. Unless you're doing a Hebrew exegetical paper, then get one of the other 2.